High Commander Zorkal stood on the bridge of the Vacor, staring out into the endless blackness of space. The silence was almost unbearable, a stark contrast to the maelstrom of misorder that had consumed them mere hours ago. Around him, the bridge was a graveyard of shattered consoles and dimmed lights, the once bustling hub of the Virexian fleet, now eerily silent. Vralcor, his sub-commander, approached cautiously, his mandibles twitching with unease.
"High Commander, the crew, what remains of them, they're asking questions."
"Questions?"
Zorkal's voice was low, dangerous. He didn't turn to face Vralcor.
"What questions could they possibly have that we don't already know the answers to?"
"They want to understand, Commander, how this could happen, how a large fleet, our fleet, could be decimated without a single shot fired."
Vralcor's voice wavered as he spoke, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Zorkal finally turned, his eyes narrowing.
"Do you think I have answers for them? That I can explain how we were defeated by an enemy we never saw? Or perhaps you have the answers, Vralcor?"
"No, High Commander,
Vralcor hesitated, then forced himself to speak.
"The reports from the survivors, they speak of a single Terran ship."
"A single ship?"
Zorkal echoed, his voice dripping with incredulity.
"Do you realize how absurd that sounds? One Terran ship taking down a large fleet. We had hundreds of vessels, the best warriors in the galaxy. This wasn't the work of a single ship."
"I know, Commander,"
Vralcor replied, his voice dropping to a whisper.
"But the evidence, the FTL signature left behind, it matches the departure of a single Terran ship. The stories, they're spreading. They're calling it a ghost ship."
Zorkal's mandibles clicked in frustration.
"Ghosts are stories for children,"
he snapped, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his own doubts. He turned back to the viewport, watching the remnants of his once mighty fleet drift aimlessly.
"And yet, what other explanation is there?"
Vralcor was silent, unsure how to respond. He had seen the failure firsthand, the way their ships had turned on one another, systems failing in the blink of an eye. And through it all, there had been no sign of the enemy, no flashes of light, no incoming fire, just the slow creeping destruction that had left them defenseless.
"What are the reports from the other ships?"
Zorkal asked after a long pause.
"The survivors?"
"They are scattered,"
Vralcor admitted.
"Few made it out, and those who did are, well, they're terrified, High Commander. They don't understand what happened, but they all describe the same thing. Systems going haywire, orders being overridden, ships firing on one another, and always the sense that something was watching them."
"Watching them,"
Zorkal repeated, his voice hollow. He turned to face Vralcor fully, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and despair.
"And you believe this was the work of a single ship? A Terran ship?"
Vralcor met his commander's gaze, forcing himself to stand firm.
"I don't know what to believe, sir, but the evidence, it all points to something we've never encountered before, something beyond our understanding."
Zorkal's mandibles clicked in frustration.
"A ghost ship. The crew is talking nonsense, and yet, what else could it be? We detected nothing, saw nothing, and yet our fleet fell apart as if some invisible hand was tearing us apart."
"The crew is scared, Commander. They need to hear from you,"
Vralcor urged.
"If you address them, reassure them."
"Reassure them of what?"
Zorkal interrupted, his voice rising.
That we were bested by a phantom? That their comrades died at the hands of something we cannot fight? How am I supposed to reassure them, Vralkor?
Vralkor fell silent, unable to answer. Zorkal turned back to the viewport, the silence stretching out between them. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice softer, almost resigned.
I thought I knew the Terrans. I thought I understood their weaknesses, their strengths. But this, I didn't anticipate this.
Vralkor took a step closer, his voice tentative.
What do we do, High Commander?
Zorkal didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the void, where the wreckage of his fleet drifted like ghosts themselves. Finally he sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of defeat.
We survive, Vralkor. We survive, and we learn. If this was indeed the work of a single ship, then we must prepare for the possibility that it will come again. And next time we will be ready.
And what of the crew?
Vralkor asked, almost hesitantly. Zorkal's voice hardened.
Tell them to hold their tongues. Ghost stories have no place in a warrior's mind. We will rebuild. We will strike back. But this time, we will remember that the Terrans are not to be underestimated.
Vralkor nodded, though the doubt lingered in his eyes.
Yes, High Commander.
As Vralkor turned to relay the orders, Zorkal remained by the viewport, his thoughts churning. The idea of a single ship, a ghost ship, still gnawed at him, refusing to be dismissed. But for now, he had to focus on survival, on rebuilding what had been lost. But in the quiet moments, in the solitude of the void, the doubts would return. And Zorkal knew deep down that the legend of the ghost ship would haunt them all for a long time to come. Earlier, the TSV Wraith moved silently through the void, its sleek, angular form nearly invisible against the backdrop of deep space. The ship's hull was coated in a matte black material that absorbed light, making it appear as nothing more than a shadow among the stars. It was a stealth ship in every sense of the word, designed to be undetectable, a ghost in the night. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. The crew of the Wraith was small, just a handful of highly trained individuals, each one hand-picked for their expertise and their ability to handle the stress of missions like this. They were quiet, focused, each one absorbed in their tasks as the ship glided closer to its target, the Virexian fleet. Captain Elias Decker stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the tactical display that dominated the room. The display showed a field of red blips, each one representing a Virexian ship. It was a large fleet, powerful and armed to the teeth. But the Wraith was different. It wasn't built for direct confrontation. It was a precision instrument, designed to strike at the heart of an enemy without them ever knowing it was there.
Captain, we are approaching the outer perimeter,
Lieutenant Sarah Carter reported, her voice steady but laced with the tension that gripped them all. She was the ship's operations officer, responsible for monitoring the Wraith's systems and ensuring they remained undetected. "Slow to minimum thrust," Decker ordered, his voice calm. "Spectre, status on our stealth systems?" "All systems are fully operational, Captain," came the smooth, synthesized voice of Spectre, the ship's AI. "We are invisible to all known Virexian detection methods." Decker nodded, his gaze still locked on the display. "Good. We're going to slip right through their defenses. Everyone, stay sharp. We're not out of the woods yet." The crew responded with quiet affirmations, their voices hushed. They all knew the stakes. One wrong move, one mistake, and the entire mission could be compromised. The Virexians were a formidable enemy, and while the Wraith was designed to avoid detection, they couldn't afford to underestimate their adversaries. Sergeant Marcus Reyes, the ship's tactical officer, leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. He was a seasoned soldier, a veteran of countless battles, but even he couldn't shake the tension that coiled in his gut. "Captain, you really think we can pull this off? We're walking into the lion's den here." Decker finally turned from the display to face his crew. His expression was calm, but there was a steely resolve in his eyes. "We've done our homework, Reyes. The Virexians won't see us coming. Spectre's running the show. Our job is to trust the plan and execute." Carter glanced over at Reyes, a small smile playing on her lips.
"You're not getting nervous on us now, are you, Reyes? I thought you liked a good challenge."
Reyes chuckled, though there was a hint of tension in his voice. "Oh, I'm all for a challenge, Lieutenant. Just make sure we know what we're getting into." Decker crossed his arms, addressing the entire bridge. "Let's go over the mission one more time. We're here to cripple this fleet, not by engaging it directly, but by turning their own systems against them. Spectre will infiltrate their networks, sowing confusion and misinformation. Our goal is to make them destroy themselves from within." He paused, letting the gravity of the mission sink in. "This is high risk, but it's also high reward. We're outnumbered, but we have the element of surprise. They won't know what hit them until it's too late."
"Captain," Spectre interjected, "I have already begun preliminary scans of the Virexian systems. Their security is formidable, but not insurmountable. With your approval, I will initiate the infiltration as soon as we are within optimal range."
Decker nodded. "Do it. Reyes, I want you ready to deploy decoys at a moment's notice. If things go sideways, we need to give them something else to chase." "Aye, sir," Reyes replied, his hands already moving over his console, preparing the decoy protocols. Carter adjusted her headset, her eyes fixed on the incoming data.
"We're almost in position, Captain. All systems are green."
Decker took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over his crew. They were ready, each one of them professionals who had been in tight spots before. But this mission was different. There was no margin for error. "Remember, our strength is in our stealth. If we're detected, we abort. We've got one shot at this, and we need to make it count." The tension on the bridge was palpable, the air charged with the weight of the mission. Each member of the crew was focused, their minds racing through the possible scenarios, the what-ifs. But beneath the tension was a thread of confidence, a belief in their abilities, in the plan, and in Spectre. "Spectre," Decker said, his voice cutting through the silence, "initiate Phase 1.
"As you command, Captain," Spectre replied, its voice calm and controlled. "Phase 1 initiated. Infiltration protocols engaged."
The crew watched as the tactical display shifted, showing Spectre's digital tendrils reaching out toward the Virexian fleet. The mission had begun, and there was no turning back. The Wraith was committed, and all they could do now was trust in their training, their ship, and each other. As the first signs of disruption began to appear on the Virexian systems, Decker allowed himself a small, tight smile. The plan was in motion, and if everything went according to Spectre's calculations, the Virexians would never know what hit them. "Stay sharp," Decker reminded his crew, his voice steady. "This is where it gets real." The Wraith moved deeper into the heart of the Virexian fleet, a ghost in the darkness, carrying with it the hopes of its crew and the promise of a mission that could turn the tide of the war. Decker's thoughts drifted as the ship inched closer to the enemy fleet. He had been in tight spots before, missions where the odds were stacked against him, and the slightest mistake could lead to disaster. But this mission was different. The Virexians were not just another enemy. They were a species bred for war, with a reputation for ruthlessness that matched their prowess in battle. He remembered the last time he had faced the Virexians, a skirmish on the outer fringes of Terran space. The Virexians had come at them with everything they had, their ships bristling with bioorganic weapons that had torn through the Terran defenses like paper. Decker had lost good people that day, and the memory still gnawed at him, fueling his resolve. This time it wouldn't be a direct fight. The Wraith wasn't built for that. Instead, they would strike from the shadows, using the element of surprise to dismantle the fleet from within. It was a strategy born out of necessity, one that relied on precision and timing rather than brute force.
Captain?
Lieutenant Sarah Carter's voice broke through his thoughts.
We're approaching their outer sensors perimeter. I'm adjusting our course to slip between their detection grids.
Good, Decker replied, his voice steady. Keep it slow and steady. We don't want to leave any traces. Sergeant Marcus Reyes, always one for conversation when the tension was high, leaned back in his chair and looked over at Carter. You know, it never gets old, this whole ghost ship routine. Feels like we're playing cat and mouse with a damn lion. Carter smirked, her fingers dancing over the controls as she fine-tuned their approach.
We've done it before, Reyes. Just stick to the plan. Spectre's got our backs.
Reyes chuckled, but the tension didn't leave his face. Yeah, and we're the ghost. Still hard to believe how much they fear us. Can you imagine the stories they'll tell after tonight? Decker turned from the display to face his crew, a small, grim smile on his lips. Let them fear. It's what keeps them on edge, always looking over their shoulders. We're the nightmare they can't see coming, and tonight we're going to remind them why. Carter nodded, her focus still on the console.
They've probably heard the rumors by now. Ships disappearing, fleets torn apart without a trace. They'll never know it's us until it's too late.
Reyes leaned forward, his expression more serious. It's one thing to be the ghost ship in theory, but pulling this off, it's still a high-wire act, Captain. Decker's gaze hardened. We've trained for this. Spectre has run the simulations 1,000 times. We'll stick to the plan and they'll never see us coming. The bridge fell into silence once more, the weight of Decker's words settling over the crew. They were deep into enemy detection range now, and even with their stealth systems, every second counted. The Virexian fleet loomed ahead, a formidable array of ships bristling with weapons and defenses. But they were oblivious to the threat that was slowly creeping toward them, hidden in the shadows. Spectre, Decker called out, his voice a calm command. Give me a status update. How close are we to optimal range?
Captain, we are approximately 30 seconds from optimal range,
Spectre responded, its voice devoid of emotion, yet filled with an underlying power.
All systems remain undetected. I am prepared to initiate infiltration on your command.
Good, Decker replied, his gaze fixed on the tactical display. Everyone get ready. This is it. Reyes exhaled slowly, his hands steadying as he prepared for what was to come. You ever wonder, Captain, what they'll say about us if we pull this off? If we actually manage to take down this fleet? Decker allowed himself a small smile. If we pull this off, Reyes, they'll be talking about the Wraith for a long time. But first we have to make sure we do it right. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The Wraith was now within striking distance, its systems poised to deliver a blow that would cripple the Virexian fleet before they even knew they were under attack.
Captain, Spectre's voice cut through the silence. We are now within optimal range. I await your command.
Decker took a deep breath, his mind clear and focused. The weight of the mission pressed down on him, but it was a weight he had carried many times before. Initiate infiltration, Spectre. Let's show them why we're the ghost.
As you command, Spectre replied.
As the first signs of disruption began to appear on the Virexian systems, Decker's thoughts returned to the stories of ghost ships. Today, those stories would become real, at least for the Virexians. They would never see the Wraith, but they would feel its presence, like a shadow passing through the night. The crew watched in silence as the green lines on the display began to merge with the red, indicating that Spectre had found its way into the Virexian systems. Getting a foothold in the enemy's network without being detected was always the hardest part. Lieutenant Sarah Carter leaned closer to her console, monitoring the progress.
Captain, we're seeing initial penetration into their communication systems. No signs of detection yet.
Good. Decker responded.
Let's keep it that way. Spectre, start with minor disruptions. We want to test the waters before we go any deeper.
As you command, Captain, Spectre acknowledged, initiating low-level disruptions.
On the Virexian command ship Vakor, High Commander Zorkal stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the vast expanse of space before him. The fleet was on high alert, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Yet something felt off. The void was too quiet, too still.
Hi, Commander. We're receiving reports of minor glitches in our communication systems,
one of his subordinates reported, a hint of uncertainty in his voice.
Nothing critical, but unusual.
Zorkal frowned, his mandibles clicking in irritation.
Have the technicians look into it. I don't want any surprises. We're in enemy territory. Everything needs to be running perfectly.
Yes, High Commander,
the officer responded, moving to relay the orders. Zorkal's unease deepened as he watched the bridge crew work. The glitches were minor, barely noticeable, but they were there, and in his experience, minor glitches had a way of becoming major problems if left unchecked. On the Wraith, Spectre continued its methodical advance. The AI's algorithms analyzed the Virexian network, mapping out the flow of data, identifying key nodes, and searching for exploitable weaknesses.
Captain, Spectre reported, I have identified several potential weak points in their network. With your permission, I will begin escalating the disruptions.
Decker nodded.
Proceed, but keep it subtle. We don't want to tip our hand too early.
Spectre's digital tendrils began to dig deeper into the Virexian systems, targeting key communication relays and navigation controls. The first disruptions were small, slight delays in data transmission, minor anomalies in sensor readouts, but they were enough to sow the seeds of confusion. Back on the Vakor, the glitches had begun to spread. Data packets were arriving out of sequence, and sensor readings were flickering, showing brief but unexplained anomalies. The crew worked to correct the issues, but the problems persisted, growing more frequent and harder to ignore.
High Commander,
another officer called out, his voice strained.
We're experiencing multiple system errors across the fleet. Communications are being delayed, and some of our ships are reporting difficulties maintaining formation.
Zorkal's eyes narrowed.
What's causing it?
We're still investigating, but it appears to be some kind of interference,
the officer replied, his mandibles twitching in frustration.
We've never seen anything like this before.
Zorkal felt a chill run down his spine. He had been in countless battles, faced enemies of all kinds, but this was different. There was no visible enemy, no clear threat, just a creeping sense of something unseen, something dangerous. On the Wraith, the tension was mounting. The crew watched as the Virexian systems began to falter, the disruptions spreading like a virus. Sergeant Marcus Reyes glanced at Decker, his face serious. They're starting to feel it, Captain. You can see the cracks forming. Decker nodded, his eyes never leaving the display.
Good, but we're not done yet. Spectre, escalate the disruptions. Target their navigation and weapon systems. We need to push them to the brink.
Understood, Captain,
Spectre replied. The AI's digital assault intensified, targeting the core systems of the Virexian ships. Navigation controls began to falter, causing ships to drift out of formation. Weapons systems experienced brief but alarming malfunctions, powering up without command or failing to respond to orders. On the Vakor, the bridge was a flurry of activity as the crew struggled to contain the growing disarray. Zorkal's frustration turned to anger as more reports flooded in, each one worse than the last.
High Commander, we're losing control of our ships,
an officer shouted, panic creeping into his voice.
Systems are failing across the fleet.
Find the source,
Zorkal roared, his mandibles flaring.
We are under attack. I want answers now!
As the Virexian crew scrambled to regain control,
Spectre took the opportunity to deepen the mayhem. The AI began altering the targeting data fed to the Virexian weapons systems, causing them to misidentify their own ships as enemies. In the confusion, some ships began firing upon each other, their weapons systems convinced they were under attack from within the fleet. The situation spiraled out of control as more ships began to fire on each other, each believing they were defending themselves from a different threat. The Virexian fleet, once a coordinated force, was now a chaotic battleground, with ships turning on one another in a deadly game of friendly fire. On the Wraith, Decker watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction as the red icons representing the Virexian ships blinked out one by one.
Spectre, status?
The fleet is in disarray, Captain, Spectre reported. Approximately 40% of their vessels have engaged each other. Casualties are mounting. Their command structure is collapsing.
Reyes shook his head in disbelief. They're tearing themselves apart. It's like they've gone mad. Decker's expression remained cold and focused. We're not finished yet. Spectre, initiate the final phase. Push their reactors to overload.
As you command, Captain, Spectre replied.
The AI's digital tendrils reached into the core of the Virexian ships, manipulating power distribution systems and overloading reactors. One by one, ships began to detonate from within, their reactors pushed beyond their limits by Spectre's relentless assault. On the Vacor, Zorcal could only watch in horror as his fleet fell apart before his eyes. The invisible enemy had struck, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. On the Wraith, Decker allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The ghost ship had done its job. The Virexian fleet, once an awe-inspiring armada, now resembled a scene of utter chaos. Ships drifted out of formation, their navigational systems compromised. Weapons fired sporadically, often at friendly targets, sometimes into the vastness of space, hitting nothing. The whole time, Spectre's digital tendrils continued to weave through their systems, sowing further confusion and discord. On the bridge of the Vacor, High Commander Zorcal watched in disbelief as the tactical display before him showed the growing disorder. His once cohesive fleet was falling apart, the red icons on the screen flickering erratically as systems failed and ships turned on each other.
"High Commander!"
an officer shouted, his voice tinged with panic.
"We've lost contact with several cruisers. They're reporting massive system failures. Navigation is down, and weapons are firing without command."
Zorcal slammed a fist down onto the console, his mandibles clicking in frustration.
How is this possible? Where is this attack coming from?
We don't know, sir,
another officer stammered, his eyes wide with fear.
Our sensors detect nothing. No enemy ships capable of electronic warfare. No incoming fire. It's as if we're being attacked from within our own systems.
Then shut it down. Isolate the infected systems. Re-establish control,
Zorcal ordered. But even as he spoke, he knew it was futile. The ghost, or whatever it was, had attacked. It was too late, and it was ripping the fleet apart from the inside out. Aboard another one of the Virexian destroyers, havoc reigned. The captain barked orders at his crew, but the bridge was a cacophony of alarms and overlapping voices. The ship's turrets had locked onto a nearby frigate, and despite the crew's desperate attempts to override the commands, the weapons fired, sending a volley of plasma rounds into the friendly vessel.
"We're hit!"
the frigate's captain shouted over the comms.
"What the hell are you doing, Dromthal? You're firing on us!" "Stand down, Krolvak! We're not in control! Something's taken over our systems!"
the destroyer captain, Dromthal, replied, his voice filled with desperation.
"We're not the enemy!"
But it was too late. The frigate, assuming treachery, returned fire, its own weapons targeting the destroyer. The bridge of the Vacor was bombarded with reports of similar incidents across the fleet. Ships firing on each other, captains turning against their comrades in confusion and fear.
"High Commander, we're losing ships at an alarming rate,"
an officer reported, his voice trembling.
The fleet is tearing itself apart! Zorkal's eyes blazed with anger and helplessness.
This is madness! We're being destroyed by an enemy we can't even see!
On the Wraith, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The crew watched as the Virexian fleet continued to disintegrate before their eyes, the tactical display now a fraction of the red dots there once were.
Captain, they've turned on each other,
Lieutenant Sarah Carter said, her voice filled with a mix of pride and professionalism.
They have no idea what's happening. Spectre has successfully completed his primary objective.
A perfectly executed plan.
Captain Elias Decker replied, his voice steady, though there was a hardness in his tone.
This isn't just about winning a battle. It's about breaking them, showing them they're vulnerable.
Sergeant Marcus Reyes, usually the one to crack a joke or lighten the mood, was uncharacteristically silent as he watched the carnage unfold.
It's like watching a beast eat itself, he murmured. We haven't even fired a shot, yet they're tearing each other apart.
Decker's gaze remained fixed on the display.
This is what happens when you let fear take control. They're fighting phantoms, and it's destroying them.
The Wraith's crew continued to monitor the situation, each member focused on their role in the operation. Despite the devastation they were witnessing, there was a sense of detachment. This was the mission, and they were executing it flawlessly.
Spectre, status report,
Decker commanded.
Approximately 60% of the Viraxian fleet has been incapacitated or destroyed,
Spectre reported, its voice calm and devoid of emotion.
Remaining ships are in a state of disarray, with significant internal conflict. Systems are failing across multiple vessels.
Keep pushing them, Decker ordered. We need to finish this.
Back on the Vacor, Zorkal was on the verge of despair. His fleet, his pride, was crumbling, and he had no way to stop it. The bridge was in shambles, officers shouting over one another as they tried to regain control, but there was no salvaging the situation. The crew completely and utterly taken by the ferocity and suddenness of what had just happened.
"Why, Commander, we have to retreat,"
one of his officers urged.
"We can't fight an enemy we can't see. We need to regroup, find a way to counter this attack."
"Retreat,"
Zorkal snarled, his eyes blazing with fury.
"And leave our ships to be slaughtered? I will not abandon my fleet."
"Sir, if we don't pull back now, there won't be a fleet left to command,"
the officer insisted, desperation in his voice. Zorkal hesitated, torn between his pride and the reality of the situation. The fleet was disintegrating around him, and every moment they stayed, more ships were lost. He clenched his fists, his body trembling with rage.
"Order a retreat,"
Zorkal finally commanded, his voice low and filled with bitterness.
"Get as many ships out as you can. We'll regroup and figure out what went wrong."
The order was relayed, but it was too late for many of the ships. As the surviving vessels attempted to disengage, Spectre struck again, targeting their thrusters and further disabling their systems. Ships that tried to flee found themselves trapped, their engines sputtering and failing. On the Wraith, the crew observed the retreat with a mix of satisfaction and somber realization. The mission was a success, but the cost to the Virexians was catastrophic.
"They're running, Captain," Reyes noted, "but there's not much left to run with."
Decker nodded, his expression unreadable.
"We've done what we came to do. Spectre, begin withdrawal procedures. Let's disappear before they figure out what hit them."
"As you command, Captain," Spectre replied, initiating protocols for stealth extraction.
The Wraith began to pull back, slipping away from the battlefield as silently as it had arrived. The Virexian fleet, now a graveyard of ships and shattered hopes, was left in disarray, its commanders struggling to comprehend the nightmare that had descended upon them. As the Wraith vanished into the void, Decker allowed himself a moment of reflection. The mission had been a success, but there was no joy in victory, only the cold satisfaction of a job well done.
"Mission accomplished,"
he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Let's hope they never forget what happened here. The Wraith continued its silent journey through the void, leaving the remnants of the Phyrexian fleet behind. The legend of the ghost ship would grow, fueled by the fear and confusion of those who had survived the encounter. And in the darkness of space, the Terrans would continue their fight, knowing that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one your enemy never sees.